So in the last two guides to Redstone, I went over a lot about the main mechanics of how Redstone works and how it's powered, and how it affects other blocks around it. I also went over repeated delays and how to use the basics of comparators. Now in this video I'm going to show you how to make use of those different mechanics, and mainly make piston doors, whilst also showing you how to make an item sorter. There's a lot more to learn here compared to the previous two, but a lot of it is the same things, just with a small extra thing added to it. It'll be pretty simple to learn when I go through all of the basics. This is everything that's going to be covered in this video. We've got sticky pistons, repeaters, redstone comparators, going more over hoppers, observers, and hopper minecarts. So the first thing is just really simple, it's just a basic piston door. It's pretty much the same of what I shared in the first video, but it's just cut in half. But of course you can't just use a pressure plate all the time, sometimes you might want to use a button. But this is a little quick. You don't really have much time to run into it. This is where we can use comparators. In the last video I showed you how to make a pulse extender using comparators, which basically will allow you to make a longer redstone signal that's longer than a button press. This will let your piston doors be opened for longer, giving you more chance to walk through it. Underneath this redstone there's nothing really here, but we can quickly change that. If I break this block, add two more, one comparator facing this way, and another one facing the other way, and that is it. But you might notice that this redstone dust isn't going to point into this block, which won't unpower the torch. This is where a really useful block comes in. The target block is great for compact redstone. I can just do this. You can see that the redstone is now redirected into the target block, and this is what makes them so good. Now when we press this button, it gives you a much bigger chance to walk through the door without face planting a block. All the doors I've shown you so far are quite small, but what if you wanted to expand them? Here's a 2x3 piston door. And it's surprisingly simple. It's almost the exact same as all the others I've shown you, but it's just a little taller. You can see that I've got a pulse extender underneath it with a repeater going into these blocks. Above it is just a block of redstone to be powered, and glass blocks or slabs on the other side, whichever you prefer, pointing into these pistons, allowing them all to be powered. And you can pretty much do this infinitely as tall as you want, as long as you have something to keep the redstone powered as it goes further up, because eventually it'll die out. This is where redstone doors start to get a lot more tricky. What if you wanted a completely flat wall with a redstone door that is hidden within it, like this? These types of piston doors can be a little complex to do, but if you know the gist of how they work, then it's quite simple, barring from one certain redstone mechanic, which we'll be going into much later in this series. The premise is that you want to have 4 pistons on one side of the door, with 2 extra pistons to push out the blocks to make it look like a completely concealed wall. The reason there's 4 pistons is because the pistons will rest here when open, and so will the blocks that are going to push out, so you're pushing out the pistons and the blocks. When considering how you want to power this door, you want to power these pistons last, and the ones that push out the blocks first. The reason why is because pistons can't push pistons that are already extended. The power from this redstone starts here and it goes into a repeater, which will further go through the circuit. A repeater set to 3 ticks is set here, going into this block, and the repeater is here, so that the repeater is not constantly powering the redstone dust next to it, because this block has been powered. This then powers these blocks, which will extend these pistons. Even though this redstone will be powered first, it's got nothing to power because the pistons will be back here. So yeah, this redstone dust will be powered first, but because there's nothing below it, nothing's getting powered. This will let these pistons push out these pistons and the blocks, which will then let these pistons be pushed out. And so in short, it creates this. Of course, as piston doors get bigger, they get more complicated, but I think I'll have an easier time explaining this one than I did with that one. This is a 3x3 piston door, and the reason why it can be tricky is because you want this block pulled out, as you can see here. It can be a bit complex, but let's see what's going on. Almost all of this is really simple. These blocks are just being pulled by these 7 pistons around it, That's really simple. It's the same as all the other piston doors over there. But what's really complicated is getting that middle block into the floor. This is what's known as a double piston extender. It pretty much allows a block to be pushed or pulled an extra block than it can normally reach. Let's look into how this works. We've got a simple pulse extender here, which pretty much just lets the door be open for longer. This line of redstone just goes into these side pistons and to the ceiling. But this is where it gets interesting. This repeater is focused into this block, which powers this redstone and onwards. The observer here is looking at this redstone waiting for it to be powered. Once it is, it'll power the block above it, which also powers this piston. This means that this piston will be first to push or pull in the circuit. As it goes into this 2-tick repeater, an observer is looking at that, which powers the block above it, which then powers this piston. Reason why this piston is here, because when this piston activates first, this block is going to be pulled down to it. Then when this piston activates second, it's going to pull this block out the way. This will then let this piston push this one up, which will then allow this block to be pulled by that piston. The observer above the 4-tick repeater here is so that this piston will be able to grab that block, and this repeater is so that this piston can retrieve this sticky piston again, and in short it creates this. I'll probably leave a well download in the comments because this can get complicated, but it gets easier from here. These doors can just be a bit complicated to do. In the last video I mentioned that repeaters have an extra mechanic which can be helpful in some niche cases. This is where you start using the side inputs of the repeater. You might have seen this before. A bedrock line on the repeater. You can still move it, but what does it do? Well, let's flick this lever and find out. The repeater isn't powering at all. This is because what this means is that the repeater is locked. If I were to turn this off, the bedrock disappears, and you're able to turn it back on again. However, if we were to power the repeater from the side, whilst the repeater is still powered, and turn this lever off, it stays powered. No matter what I do, it's going to keep powered until it's unlocked again. This can be useful in some certain combination locks. I can't find many other cases where this is really helpful. So I have some spaghetti redstone over here. It all just leads into this line of redstone torches, and the goal is to turn off the redstone lamp. You can't just flick all the levers and hope it turns off. This is because it uses the lock feature in repeaters to stop certain circuits from being powered. This means that you have to activate it in a certain way. I've put in the sign here, 2, 1, 3, 2. That's the order of which you got to flick it. And there you go. I might have used this feature maybe twice in my whole life. I don't find many uses for it, but it's something that exists and it might have potential use for your builds. Now we're moving on to comparators. As I showed you in the last video, comparators can check how full a lot of blocks are and check their redstone state. These are probably the most important blocks that you want to use these with. For example, with a composter. It'll detect if the composter has anything inside of it. The crafter can check if there's items inside of it, but also it can check if any amount of the crafting interface has been filled up by disabling the tiles. Comparators with hoppers are able to check if there's items inside of the hopper, pretty much the same as the auto crafter. And a comparator on a copper bulb is able to see if it's powered or not. These two blocks are very commonly used because this is what's known as a T flip-flop. Pretty much what that means is that it does the same as a lever, but just with a button press instead. So even though the button is unpowered, the comparator is still on, which will give you a redstone signal, and you can press it again to toggle it off. And now we're coming back to piston doors, but this time rather than just using buttons and pressure plates, we use some more creative methods of opening doors. You can use comparators with hoppers to throw items into the hopper to power redstone doors. It's essentially the same as a regular piston door, but all you need is just a hopper and a comparator. And now this is a very useful redstone door that I use a lot in multiplayer servers, but it also has some complexity behind it and a lot of extra steps that I'll have to show you before I properly go in depth with this door. Let's say I quickly wanted to pick a light blue concrete block from this, throw it into the hopper. The door opens just fine, and it returned me my concrete block. However, if I wanted to use something different, like blue stained glass, nothing happens. This is because the door will only open when I give it the block I want it to give, which I chose as light blue concrete. Most of this is relatively the same as a regular piston door, aside from this little bit here. This is an item sorter. That's how you allow it to give it any specific item you want without others being able to break in. And other people would need to know the same item so that they could get in themselves. Before I show you how to make an item sorter, there's two things you need to know. There's something about hoppers and another thing about comparators. If I were to get the pufferfish out of this barrel and put them in the top barrel, the hopper is taking the pufferfish out of the barrel and putting them into this one. However, if the block that's connected to the hopper is powered, it stops transferring the items. This is what's known as hopper locking, and it's an essential feature of hoppers, and without it, this design of the item sorter would not be possible. Hoppers can be locked with both hard-powered and soft-powered blocks, so you have to be careful with what blocks are powered around your hoppers if you want them to keep unlocked. The next thing about comparators is a little bit more numbers based, but I like to do a method that's known as brute force and keep doing it until you get the right result. What I mean by this is that comparators don't give a signal if there's an item or not in the hopper. It gives you a signal based on the contents of the items inside of it relative to the amount it can hold. That sentence was a mouthful, but let me show you. If I were to throw these 6 pork chops into the hopper, it's going to give me a signal strength of 1, which isn't a lot. We want to power that redstone lamp all the way over there, and it's going to take a lot of pork chops to be able to do that. The maximum power that comparators or anything can output is 15 blocks worth of power, and we only have 1 with these pork chops. However, if we put in 6 snowballs, same as 6 pork chops, it's filled up 2. This is because snowballs stack to 16, and it's closer to being full than if it were 6 pork chops. It's kind of percentage based, and if we were to add a non-stackable item like mushroom stew, it'll count as a full stack of blocks, powering a full 3 blocks. The more we fill of it, the more power it gives. If we were to fill it fully with mushroom stew, it completely powers the redstone lamp. But don't forget that this isn't the same as if I were to use a barrel instead of a hopper. Because barrels have more slots than a hopper, you're going to have to fill it a lot more to be able to get the full signal strength. If I were to fill these 5 slots in the hopper with mushroom stew, the comparator is going to max out. If I did the same in the barrel, it's not even going to give nearly as much power, because it's checking how full it is compared to how much it can hold. Another really useful thing with comparators is lecterns. You might see these in the Redstone Components tab and wonder why it's even there. This is because lecterns have more function than just reading a book. When a book is placed on here, depending on the amount of pages the book has, the Redstone comparator will light up, the same as if you were to fill a hopper. And because the maximum signal strength is 15, if we were to add 15 pages like we have here, we can just change however much power we want. Say if we wanted 8 blocks worth of power, we've got 8 blocks worth of power here. And if we were to turn the page all the way to the end, the redstone lamp is lit. Using the knowledge I just shown, this is the item sorter. It makes use of a partially full hopper in a clever way that only allows 1 item to get through once it's been added to it. If we look into this top hopper here, you can see that I've got 4 redstone dust and 41 pufferfish. Well, why the redstone dust and why the pufferfish? The pufferfish is what we want to go in the hopper. If we were to add any more into it, it's going to reduce it back to 41 again. And we've got an extra pufferfish down here. I do the same again. We got 2. The redstone dust here is what's known as a filter item. You might want to use something that's renamed just into a bunch of gibberish so that it reduces the chances of anybody else throwing these items in, because you don't want these to be messed with. You only want the value of the pufferfish to change. Let's talk about how the item sorter works though. Well, the reason there's 41 pufferfish is because in total there's 45 items. This lets the comparator output a level 2 power source. However, if it went to 46 items, it'll go to level 3, which would then emit a redstone signal long enough to go into this block, which the repeater would pick up, unpower the torch, which was powering this block here, which will then unpower this hopper for about 2 ticks, which is just enough time to let 1 item slip through. If we were to completely fill the slot of pufferfish to a stack, and so long as that hopper has more than 46 items, that hopper is going to be unlocked and going to keep putting items into the barrel until it reaches that 41 again. The neat thing with this design of the item sorter is that it's tileable. What this means is that you can place it next to another without it interfering with each other. I've got a bunch of different sorters here, each with their own thing, and this top row of hoppers here is purely to allow the items to travel through. If I were to throw these in any random order, you're going to see that slowly only getting the items that are in their designated barrels. Now when we go back to the redstone door, we can see that this just uses one item sorter. You can see that I've put in 4 glowstone dust that's been renamed. This reduces the chances of anyone else throwing any of these items in there, so they just throw in the light blue concrete. Once the hopper reaches 46 items, it'll then activate this redstone circuit. This bit here is just for the hopper to give back the light blue concrete that I throw at it, with a small delay to allow the hoppers to be able to place it in the dropper in time to allow it to dispense. And once this comparator outputs the level 3 signal, this repeater will activate with a pulse extender to activate the pistons. So you can see here, works fine. Now here's the last example of a piston door. This is if you want to really conceal your base, and you also want to be able to lock it from other people. This makes use of hopper minecarts, comparators and observers. However, it does not have a specific lock, so anyone can throw any item there, but they really need to know where they're throwing it to be able to unlock the door. If I took this flower and threw it where this flower is placed, this door unlocks, allowing me to jump in, and it closes behind me. Let's take a look into why this is happening. Hopper minecarts have a slightly more generous range in which they can pick up items above them. When they're standing on a rail, they're able to pick up items from an entire block above them. When this minecart picks up the item, it'll go into this hopper, which this comparator will detect. As I showed in the last video, a comparator is able to check the contents of a block through a solid block. When it powers this block, it'll activate this pulse extender, which is just for the door. That's simple. But the most important part is here. If I were to break these blocks underneath, you see that there's a sticky piston underneath. The reason why I place this is simply just to make this more compact, but you don't have to copy this exactly, but I'll explain how it happens. The purpose of the sticky piston is just to get a 1-tick pulse for this redstone. I made an example over here. You can only just see, if I were to go in free cam whilst I do this, you can see that the redstone lights up for just 1 in-game tick. The reason why is because this repeater is powering the block which the piston is also connected to, so it pushes the block up, but it also powers this redstone. But the moment the block is pushed up, it won't be able to power this redstone anymore, so it only activates it for a tick. This little circuit takes advantage of the block that's been pushed up, and I've used a copper bulb which an observer is looking at. The observer will then power this block which is connected to the piston, and this is where another feature comes in. You might have noticed in this circuit that this sticky piston is not pushing and pulling. This is because of what happens when you power a sticky piston for 1 tick. This is a small example I made for it. If I were to power a piston normally, it pulls the block with it. But if I power it fast enough, for just 1 tick, it doesn't have time to really retract and pull the block, so it just sticks up in the air. Observers are able to do this for you, so it just allows you to easily do the 1-tick pulse. This allows a toggleable lock on hopper minecart. But what good is this? Well, when the hopper minecart is on top of a rail, it can pick up the block easily. However, when it's not standing on the rail anymore, it's not able to pick up any blocks. You can tell that the hopper minecart just barely drops by 1 pixel. This stops it from picking up blocks. So if I were to do this, drop down here, and now nobody else will be able to get in unless I push this button, which unlocks it again. And you might notice that I've used the repeater locking here. And the only reason I've done this is to allow the key to be locked whilst not opening the door. Otherwise, it would have done this. I know this video might have been a lot more confusing than the last one, but that's what happens when you start using these examples. I tried to explain them the best I could, and if you have any questions, then feel free to ask some in the comments. I'll probably leave a world download in the description so that you can test this world out for yourself and take these circuits apart to learn yourself. In the next guide to Redstone, we're going to be going over the final use of comparators, which I haven't shown you yet, and we're going to be going over how to use auto crafters.